My name is Ruth Halbreich, and I was born in Poland, Warsaw, where I lived until 1944. In 1939, when the war started, it found me with my family in our summer cottage outside of Warsaw. My father quickly came and gathered us, brought us back to Warsaw, where we found that we had to stay in the basement for the next 2 days and nights because of the falling bombs. He decided to run away from Warsaw before the Germans came into Warsaw. And so, on a truck which he luckily had in his factory, we all piled up and started out towards east, towards Russia. When we left Warsaw, we realized that probably a third of the Jewish population has left Warsaw and had the same idea we had, to just leave Warsaw behind before the Germans came in. And especially my mother, she was just petrified of the Germans. My father didn't like the idea of going to Russia, but because my mother was so scared, so he decided to take the family away.
How large was the family?
My parents had 4 children. We were 3 daughters and 1 son. My brother was the oldest in the family. Thank God we're all alive. It was only a little over a year ago that we lost our dear mother. In Russia we settled, and we didn't really have to go deep into Russia because the Russians took over part of Poland, and so we settled in Brześć nad Bugiem. The children started school, and my father even started doing business there, for he had his old customers all over the city.
What business was he in?
He was in the paper business. My father had one of the paper mills in Poland, and I believe that in Poland they only had 3 paper mills. He was mainly manufacturing tissue, which was used in rolling up cigarettes. Well, my father was one of the few people decided soon afterwards to go back to Warsaw and look after his business and after our home. And against my mother's wishes, he and a friend left. He found that our home was destroyed, but his factory was intact. He decided to bring back the whole family to Warsaw, but that was impossible to bring 5 people because it meant crossing an illegal border in the middle of the winter where the snow came up to your chest. And even snow is very light and fluffy, but it is extremely difficult to walk in snow. Well, 1 person at a time could be taken over this illegal border. And of course it became a business because many people were crossing the border back and forth. And the farmers knew the border so well, so they were taking people across the border. Well, I was the first one. I volunteered to come I was very close to my father all my life, and I wanted really to be with my father. So I was the first one to come back to Warsaw. My father sent back 2 people to bring another child, and my older sister Helen came back. Soon afterwards, he sent 3 people to bring back my mother with the 2 remaining children. Well, she no longer was there, for she was sent by the Russians to Siberia, and that was the lucky strike. Well, we stayed with my father in my aunt's house. We had 1 aunt and uncle in Warsaw, was the brother of my father, and we stayed in their home. Soon afterwards, the Germans began building a wall around certain streets, and we knew that we would be put into a certain section which would be the Warsaw Ghetto. And that's what exactly happened in the spring of 1940. In the ghetto, we settled. Since my father had a lot of merchandise, he was able to sell it little by little. And a black market existed. So even though food was rationed for everybody, it was really enough to starve. He was able to buy extra food because he was able to pay with merchandise, which was very much in demand because smokers need their cigarettes. So we really weren't hungry. And we settled to sort of a life in the ghetto. School wasn't allowed, but everybody was studying. We had teachers come to our house teaching us languages, and for certain different subjects we would go to teachers' homes, and really an awful lot of studying was going on. Even dance classes and even drama classes, and we took advantage because there was nothing else to do. Since there was a curfew, because after 9 o'clock in the evening no one was allowed in the streets. So we really had a very long evening for study. And so we even took singing lessons, whether we had a voice or not. But it was nice to sit at home at night and sing and perform and dance. And this was really our pleasure. Well, that went on sort of in a quiet way until 1942, June, when all of a sudden German trucks would come storm into the Warsaw Ghetto and just at random catch people, women, children, men, young and old, anyone, just load up a full truck of people and take them out. And unfortunately, as we found out later, the people were taken straight to the gas chambers through Majdanek or through Treblinka, and they were people that were gassed right away. Well, we became very afraid, and we decided to build a hiding place so that when it would happen again, we would be in a hiding place. The Germans would come in with each day practically much more often, and not only would they catch people in the streets, because people became smart, they wouldn't stay in the streets, they would go into the buildings and get people out. Well, we lived in a very large apartment, and one of the rooms had a small door which we covered and nailed a huge old-fashioned wardrobe and filled it with clothing. And through the wardrobe we would sit in our little hiding place. Because as soon as the German trucks came into the ghetto, people would know it, because you could hear screams mostly. And that's when we would go into our hiding place. They also had people come and call out people in our language, in Jewish, begging people to come out and explaining to people that we wouldn't be harmed, that we would go to work, that the Germans needed working people, that we should come out and not be afraid. But of course, we didn't believe them, and we stayed in our hiding place, and we must have been in a tiny room, about 40 people, squeezed in like sardines. But as soon as things would be very quiet, we would again come out. Meanwhile, all of us really belonged to factories, because the people in the Warsaw Ghetto mostly made brushes for the German government. And whoever was employed by a brush factory wore a button. And supposedly, as long as you had the button on, you wouldn't be caught, because you were needed, you were working for the German government. But it really wasn't so. When the German trucks came in, they just caught anyone. Well, my sister became very ill at this point. And when we talked, my father talked to a friend doctor. The doctor suggested that if there is only a chance for her to get out of the ghetto and maybe live outside in the country, that it would be very good for her. And so she was getting paler and paler with each day, and she had some infection in her body. My father tried to arrange for her to come out of the ghetto. The only way that I remember anyone coming out of the ghetto is on a truck taking out merchandise from the factories, the brushes from the factories, and that was getting out legally, because you indeed had to go through a gate where a German policeman was standing, and he would really check out the people that are on the truck. Well, there was a driver, and with a driver there was usually one more person, and this one more person was this time my sister. Before she left the ghetto, my father arranged also for her to have very good ID papers, and they were papers that came out of a church. So she was also a Catholic right there, and she had papers from really a deceased person. Now, before the ghetto was formed, my father arranged so that his complete business was taken over by one of his customers, a Christian man. My father gave over his office to him, taught him the business from the manufacturing and wholesale side of it, since the man had a retail store and he was only a customer of my father's. And in exchange, he promised to do everything he could to save his children, my father's children, because it was his only wish to save his children. He truly believed that my mother and the two other children would be saved. And
was there any correspondence
yes,
back and forth?
Yes. We, up until the Russian war, we had letters from my mother. In fact, we would pack up pieces of clothing and send, and she would receive the packages. She was in Arkhangelsk in Siberia, and we would be getting from them very nice letters. So it was for us really a very happy time to know that she wasn't with us, and we really knew that she had such a good chance of surviving with the two children. Well, my father really succeeded and was very fortunate with his friend, who was a very honest man. And first of all, he loved children, and he knew us before the war. He often visited us, and he adored us. What can I say? We were 4 children. He didn't have any. And he would come to us Shabbat and eat fish and chicken soup and spend a good part of the day in our house. But mostly he enjoyed the children. Well, he would have had us in his house all the time, except his wife was very scared, and I can understand very well why. Because if the Nazis uncovered us, she would have been shot just the same together. Well, he was a very devout Catholic, and he supported an orphanage near Warsaw. He would spend his Sundays in the orphanage with the children, and every time he came there, he would bring bags of candies and chocolates and slippers and socks and whatever he could buy for the children. They had 160 children of all ages. They were practically self-supporting, for they grew their own food, made their own bread. They had their own school for the children. And so when my sister came out of the ghetto, she spent one night in my father's office, and it was now Mr. Kopczynski's office, and the next day she was taken to the convent. So it was a wonderful place. It really was like going from hell to heaven. overnight. And my father was very relieved because he believed that she would get to feel better. And she was given good medical care in the convent. And in a few weeks, she really began feeling wonderful. Now, my sister Helen was about 16 years of age. And at 16, most of the children in the convent were already being sent out to different cities, different jobs. But they decided to keep her because Mr. Kopczynski wanted her to be there. She was supposedly an orphan, they were told by him, and that her parents were killed by the Russians. And he wanted her to be there and help the sisters with the children. So she was in charge of the nursery, and she loved it. And she was very safe, and she was improving every day. Well, I stayed in the ghetto with my father, and times were getting worse with every day because there was more catching, and there were fewer of us. And the ghetto was getting smaller and smaller. And my father kept begging me to get out of the ghetto just as long as there was time yet. But I hated to leave him. And I said, I will come out when you'll be ready to come out and stay out. Well, there came a time when so many people were caught that we really felt that that was almost the end of it. And so I decided to listen to him, and I came out of the ghetto in January of 1943. And I went through the same thing.
Were you alone, or did you have Ostra?
I was alone. One person at a time came out.
How old were you at that time?
Pardon?
How old were you at that time?
It was 1943, so I believe 17 or 17 and a half, yes. And I, too, slept one night in my father's old office, which I remembered from before the war so well, and then was taken to the same convent, met my sister, and I was put in charge of little older children. The next person to come out of the ghetto was a 12-year-old girl by the name of Osnas, and she was the daughter of my father's business partner. Unfortunately, her father was walking in the streets when a German truck or car drove into the ghetto, and he was shot right in the street. So he was no longer there. Osnas was brought into the convent as well. We stayed in the convent from end of January 1943 until the following spring, 44. When all of a sudden a sister woke us up at night, especially Osnas and me, since when we came out of the ghetto, we came out without any IDs. It was impossible for my father to supply us with any. The sisters knew it. And so they took us to the train and in the middle of the night dropped us off at Mr. Kopczynski's house. They were very worried about keeping us there, for they found out that the Gestapo is seeking out Jewish children in many convents. And that meant, big trouble for the sisters, and they couldn't, put at stake the lives of so many young children. So we found ourselves in his house, and he was wonderful to us, except that his wife, again, she was very worried. Well, Mr. Kopczynski found a man who was a policeman in Warsaw, and he said that he would keep us in an extra room, but wanted to be paid with American gold dollars each month. And so Mr. Kopczynski agreed. We stayed with him, and he would come every 4 weeks and pay him with gold coins. Because sometimes by counting out the coins, some of them would fall on the floor. And so I would see through the partly open door, because we stayed in one room, we never left the room. And we stayed there until the fall of 1944, until the Polish Uprising. All of a sudden, I looked out of the window, and I believe it was September 1944, and I could see barricades all over the corner streets. And I said to the policeman's wife, I says, "What's happening? It is so quiet, and why is everything barricaded?" She says, "Well, it is an uprising took place, and the Germans left Warsaw, and we're hoping that we'll be free." Well, the Germans came in with airplanes and bombs, and they practically, they leveled Warsaw completely. But meanwhile, we indeed felt very free. I came out of the hiding place, holding Osnas by my hand, for I felt always very responsible for her. And on foot, we went to Mr. Kopczynski's house, who was very happy to see us. But while the bombs were falling, we had to be in the shelter in the basement. Well, before we knew, the Germans were back in Warsaw, unfortunately. And they were gathering up the complete population, and we had to follow certain streets, which took us into waiting trains. And we found out that we were being taken into Germany as slave laborers. Well, that idea appealed to me very much, because I no longer had to hide. Nobody knew me, and and I didn't need any ID, because Warsaw was leveled, and everything was burned and lost, and I wasn't the only one. Most of the people had no IDs. So Osnas and I felt wonderful. And we, by train, went into Germany, into a camp, which later segregated the people and sent us into different places of work. There were 15,000 of us, and that's a lot of people. I met a man there who was very sympathetic to us, for he saw me, a young girl, with a little girl, and wanted to know which barrack we sleep in. And so I told him. So for the next few evenings, he would bring a big pot of soup to us in the evening, so we would have extra food. And one evening he said to us, "I want to give you a little advice, because tomorrow morning they will call you all out to come out, and most of you people will be sent to a munition factory, which is underground. Why don't you just stay in the barrack? Even so, people will be coming in and chasing you out of here. Just go out and come right back in, so you won't be going to work in the munition factory." And that's what we did. We were in and out of the barrack many times until it all quieted down, no one was around, and we stayed by ourselves inside. And indeed, they took most of the people to the munition factory in Nordhausen. The following day, they called us all, the rest of the people, out, and we were sent into different directions as domestic help mostly. And so Osnas and I wound up in Nordhausen, and we were sent to a restaurant, and we had wonderful working conditions. It was hard work in the kitchen, because they let us do the real hard work. But still, we had a room, and it was a warm room, and we really had a bed, and we didn't believe that we'd ever again sleep in a real bed with a cover. Women were running the restaurant. It was actually a hotel and restaurant. Hotel was closed. And we worked in the kitchen. One of our chores was to bring every morning from across the street coal and start a fire so that the whole place would get heat. Well, it was very hard, big baskets of coal to be carrying across the street in deep snow. And I felt that it wasn't really too much for me. I could do it, but I felt very sorry for Osnas doing it. And so one day I decided to have a little talk with the women, and I explained to them that she's only 12 years old. And since one of them had also had a 12-year-old little son, they were very receptive and understood. And from then on, Osnas didn't have to do anything. She was able to go out with their little son and sled ride. It was a very cold and icy winter. And she could do anything she wanted to. If she wanted to help us, it was okay. If she didn't want to, it was okay too. And so I was very satisfied, and I was happy for Osnas. For I remember her as a child. She had polio. And she came out of the polio perfect. She was a copy of Shirley Temple from top to toe, including her talent. At 3 years old, she was playing piano beautifully. In fact, her governess was a person who was in the Jewish theater in Warsaw. And so I felt so good for her, for I loved her.
What about her hair? You were telling me that.
She had, yes, she was a brown-haired little girl. But what bothered me most and what scared me most was that her hair was very kinky. And of course I was worried that she would be recognized as a Jewish. Maybe she wouldn't, but I used to think so. That was one area that scared me. And so I used to buy bleach, plain bleach, and bleach her hair. And it looked terrible. And bunches would come out because I'd burn her hair. But she had so much hair that it didn't matter. She still had too much hair, no matter how much hair was burned out. But she was blondish, so I felt much better. But I made her suffer, I know. And we worked in the kitchen until April of 1945. When one afternoon, the American planes came over the whole city of Nordhausen and just scribbled. Now, we knew what was coming the next day. The next day, the real planes were coming with the bombs, and they completely flattened the city. We hardly were able to get out of the shelter, and on foot started going with all the Germans and with the 3 women for whom we worked. We went to a little city of Sondershausen, which wasn't too far away. Part of the way we were able to take a train. And we were in Sondershausen, and of course the plane followed us, and they did the same thing in Sondershausen. We mostly spent the time in the shelter in the basements, where one day all of a sudden the door was open and I could hear English language. Well, I came out because I knew I didn't understand the English, even so I studied it a little bit. But Americans I didn't understand. See, their accent was entirely different. English, I could understand. Well, I walked out, and I introduced myself to an American soldier. He happened to be Jewish. And I told him that I am Jewish from Warsaw. And I don't know where to go or what to do from now on. Well, he said, asked me whether I was alone or there were more of us. And I said, I have my friend. And I called up Osnas. Right away, he took us to a local hotel and gave us a room. That's where the American soldiers were staying. He gave us a room. He took out from his back pocket a Hebrew prayer book. But at this point, I was so excited that I couldn't read one word of Hebrew. Not only that I couldn't read one word of Hebrew, I couldn't say a word of Jewish, which is unbelievable because I spoke Jewish. I couldn't say one word. All of a sudden, I forgot the complete language.
You froze?
Yes, I completely froze. And I said to him, do you know that I knew how to speak Jewish. I don't know how to say a word to you. You just have to believe me. And so several days passed by, and he sort of took care of us. He would bring us bags of food and bags of clothing, for we had nothing at all.
How did you communicate with him? In what language?
English.
Oh.
I knew a few words. Just a few words. And then, of course, a few words of Jewish came back, and so he was smiling and he was very happy. Well, after a few days, he says, it makes really no sense for you to be here. So he took us on his military car and drove us to a camp, and it was Dora. It was a very well-known, very large concentration camp, where underground they were making the V1 and V2 bombs. But after the war, they transformed it and for displaced persons, because they had all the barracks and all the beds there. And so there was a section for every kind of person, Polish, French, Belgium, whatever. And he took us to a barrack where there were Polish people, Jews and non-Jews. And we didn't know what we would do at all, except we knew that we were with Polish people, and so we sort of felt we belonged there. We knew that we don't want to go back to Poland, and we knew that we don't want to stay in Germany. Well, one evening, there was also a hospital, big hospital in Dora. And one evening, I walked up to the hospital, and I offered to work for them. They had sick people. They also were doing an awful lot of work in their offices, you see. And so they took me in and said, okay, you'll be segregating certain type of papers, which we need for the Americans and others we need for the English and for the French. Okay, at this point, I saw a group of people come up to the hospital. Among them was my husband, and there were several Americans. My husband was with the War Crimes Commission.
Was this the first time you met him, or had you known him before?
No, that's where I met him.
Huh.
I met him in Dora at the hospital. He came up to pick up a lot of information, which we were segregating, for the Nuremberg trials. He was helping prepare the Nuremberg trials. And so we met. And he asked me where I come from. I told him that I am from Poland, and so we spoke Polish for a little while. And he invited me to come to a certain barrack the same evening. He says, there is going to be a lot of people, why don't you come? And so I came. And I wouldn't admit yet, even in the evening, it was sort of a party, get-together, that I was Jewish. Because, that part froze in me. I still didn't want anyone, I wasn't sure yet to know that I was Jewish. Of course, except for the American soldier, I told him. Mm-hmm. And so he recognized that I was Jewish, and he said to me, now you don't need to hide it. It's okay to say that you're Jewish. And he would come and visit Osnas and me quite often. And at one point he says, what do you want to do? And we told him that we don't care to go to Poland and we want to stay in Germany. And he says, well, the French people are getting on a train real soon, and they will be sent back to France, just like the Polish people will be going back to Poland. And I said, could I go to France? And he says, well, I can maybe try and arrange it. And he sure did. And so Osnas and I found ourselves soon on the French train going to Paris.
Had you yet heard anything about your family?
No. The reason I wanted to go to Paris, because he told me that from Paris, you can write letters anywhere. And the mail is regular. Well, as soon as we came to Paris, of course, we didn't know anybody, but Rothschild's homes were open to the Jewish displaced persons. So we were given a room in a home like that, and in the basement they had a kitchen set up so that you could go and eat, and it was okay for the time being. Of course, I found a job right away, and I was working with a Polish family, helping them sew. A lot of people were doing sewing in their homes in Paris at the time, and so it was fine for me, and I was earning money, and Osnas was at home. She didn't do anything, but I wrote a letter to Palestine, where she had an aunt living, who only went to Palestine like in 1936. And I explained to her that she's with me in Paris, that she lost everybody. And very soon I received a letter from her begging me to do anything I can to send Osnas back to Palestine, to be with her. Well, the only way that Osnas could go to Palestine was with the Aliyah Beit, which was the illegal way of going to Palestine, and an awful lot of people were being smuggled in. Again, I wrote to Zig, who was in Germany yet, of how I can arrange it, and he sent his friends to Paris, as it turned out, all the time to arrange Aliyah Beits. And so Osnas was taken one night on a boat on the way to Palestine. As it turned out, she had a very difficult trip because she was caught and spent some time on Cyprus. But in the end, she came to Palestine and was reunited with her aunt.
How was it for you, though, to lose her then?
I was very sad. As a matter of fact, when I knew that I lost my father, I must have spent like 2 or 3 months crying 24 hours a day. And I did the same thing after I parted with Osnas. For I went to work and I spent every penny I had buying her a new suitcase, and I filled it up with everything that was beautiful and new. And I gave, even so, it all fell into the ocean, and she never used any of it, and never saw any of it. But I did it for her, and it felt good. I loved her. I still love her, and of course I see her every time I go to Israel, and we write to one another, and she is wonderful. And
but she had a hard time getting in.
Yes, and very soon after she got to Israel, let's see, it was 1945. Oh, no, it wasn't until 1948 that she was taken into the army in Israel. And, you know, she was part of the War of Independence, yes. But she's there and she's happy. She has a wonderful family. Of course, my mother was there, and my mother felt very, very close to her. And I stayed in Paris, worked some more, and Sikkim.
You mentioned that you had heard about your father.
Oh, yes. While I was in Paris, I also wrote letters to Warsaw, because I have heard that there is a small Jewish community that operates in Warsaw. And so I decided to write every day a letter, hoping that someone would answer. Okay. As it turned out, my sister Helen worked at the Jewish community, and she was typing for them. And she would receive every day a letter from me. Well, the day came that I received a letter from her, and that was one of the happiest days of my life. For she said that she was well. Even so, while we were separated, she had typhus and was very ill. But the sisters took good care of her, and she was well and okay. And we, from then on, were just writing letters nonstop. Meanwhile, Sig came to see me twice. And we decided that maybe we should be together. And since his work with the War Crimes Branch wasn't finished, that maybe I should try and go back to Germany, and we would get married and stay in Germany for a while. And that's what I did. Because by then I could also write letters from Germany, and my sister, would be getting them. I went back to Germany, and I received the letter soon afterwards. that my mother and with the two children had come back from Russia. Now that was the second happiest day of my life. And mother wasn't allowed to come and live in Warsaw because the city had very few buildings that were livable. And so the people that came from Russia were settled in different parts of Poland. But she, by train and car and foot, decided one day to go to Warsaw, to the Jewish community, and really look up all the lists of people that are still alive. And of all people, naturally, she found my sister. Well, supposedly that the screams were heard for a long time all through the city. And they were reunited. And, of course, my mother knew right away that I was alive. My mother carried a tiny little picture, and I have the picture now, which is probably 1 inch by 2 inches. And it was a picture of the two of us, my sister Helen and myself, which we took in 1941 in the ghetto. Just before the Russian war, we were still able to mail it to Siberia to my mother. She kept looking at the pictures and really believing. She kept saying every day, I know they will be alive, and I know that I will see them. So that's what she said right away to my sister Helen.
She had an optimism in her life, in her way.
Yes, all her life. All
even
her
to the
life.
end.
To the very end. Yes, to the very end. The day before she died, in fact, at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, she says, I think that maybe from now on it'll be better. I think I'm getting better. And of course the following day she died, and we knew that she couldn't possibly be better. Mm-hmm. Yes. And while I was in Germany, we heard that President Truman created a special quota for displaced persons in Europe who wished to come to the United States, because it really wasn't an easy matter to come. For instance, we were Poles, and our quota was always filled. We needed to register. Normally, we needed to register and to wait for years before being able to enter. Well, we took advantage of his special quota, and we came to the United States. We also knew that if my mother and the children could come over from Poland into Germany, that they could come with us, because there was room for people that wanted to leave. Well, and we kept writing and begging her to come, but for some reason, her own reasons, she didn't come. So my husband and I came to the United States in 1946, the summer of 1946. My mother stayed on in Poland until 1947. She and the two children went to Israel and made their home there. So she was very happy there, lived there. She died just a little over a year ago is when we lost her. She came to visit us several times, and most important, of course, for my son's bar mitzvah, she was here, and for my daughter's wedding, she was here. Her heart was always very close to America, because as an infant, she lost her father in the Russian army. Her mother remarried, and times were, and her mother moved from Russia to Warsaw with her new husband. And in the next few years, a few children were born, 3 stepsisters and 1 stepbrother, and my mother was the oldest. Her stepfather would come to the United States many times. For a year at a time, he would work in New York as a shoemaker, save a little money, and go back to Warsaw, and had enough to sustain the family for a while. Well, in the early 20s, he had already a chance and enough money to bring the family over to New York. And so my grandmother, her husband, and all the stepchildren came to America in the early 20s. At the same time, my mother was about 16, and she was married. And so my father really didn't want to come to America because he was a young man and doing very well, considering he was doing very well for himself.
He had also been orphaned, did you say?
He had been orphaned very young, and he only had one brother. They were a family of 12 children, and all children died very young or in childbirth. He was left and one brother. Now, his brother never had any children, so the four of us always felt that we have two mothers and two fathers. And my father stayed in Poland, and he continued to do very well, and never thought of going or leaving Poland. We were one of the families, I remember in 1938, in 1939, all four children were in private high schools, which was pretty unusual because it was all private and it was all very expensive. And we were given a choice of any high school we wanted. So we chose very special high schools, and there were some that were much more expensive than others. And we were four very outgoing children, and we each chose a different high school, which, you know, now that I think back, seems to be very interesting. Now, in 1939, my mother was ready to come to the World's Fair in New York, and that was the first time that she was going to see her mother after maybe between 20 and 25 years. Maybe 20 years or 22 years, maybe, yes. She was all ready. And, of course, the war broke out, and she never made it. But when she came to America for the very first time to my son's bar mitzvah, she, of course, met her whole family in New York. And by that time, my brother lived in New York. He had moved from Israel to New York. Some members of the family wanted the press to come and interview them all, but my brother was so protective of my mother, he didn't want her to get too excited, and he said, absolutely not, this will be very private. And so they had a most wonderful get-together, and she met all her sisters and her brother and all their children, and it was wonderful that she really lived to see it all.
Tell me more about what happened to your father. We missed that piece, I think.
Yes, we did. Well, as you know, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place in 1943 in April. It was Passover, right? Well, I left the ghetto in January, and my father was able to come out of the ghetto once more on a truck with merchandise, and I came to Warsaw and met him in his office. He felt that maybe that was going to be our last visit together, because he gave me one of his hankies. I don't know, for some reason he pulled out a maroon hanky, was folded and clean, and gave it to me. I have it to this day, of course. Gave me a hanky, and he told me that if the war is over, we will probably meet, he said. But if we don't meet, he said, Ruth, you really don't have to tell anybody that you were ever Jewish. He just felt that we as kids suffered enough. Of course, he was only 43 years old. He was born in 1900. But he kept saying all along, well, at least I lived At least I live. But my children didn't live yet. But of course, his wish came true, for he saved us. He saved his children, and he must know it. And that was his biggest wish. And I said goodbye to him. He went back into the ghetto. Because after my last visit, he yet was able to send out Osnas out of the ghetto. Now, out of my immediate family, no one was there. The only person that was in the ghetto, and he really went back to save, was Osna's mother. But of course the fighting started, and the German tanks rolled into Warsaw, and we really have no idea what happened to him. So he could have been killed right there, or he could have been sent to a gas chamber. We really have no way of telling what happened, because I really don't believe that he was sent anywhere, because he never wrote a card to anybody. And most of the places people were, if they were sent and let work for a while, like Auschwitz, they were able to smuggle out or send out some kind of a card or letter through people and let somebody know. Because I kept in touch with Mr. Kopczynski, and he had never heard about my father at all. Now, he had one card from Osna's mother, from Treblinka. So she sent to him a card, and he told us that he heard from her once. Now, she was also either killed, or we really don't know exactly what happened to her. So we lost our father in 1943. We were in the convent when this happened, and we could see the flames and the smoke from the convent, from the Warsaw Ghetto. And so my sister and I and Osnas, we were so upset that our Mother Superior, she was always super nice to us, but she came over and she could tell that there was something wrong with us. And she said, "What's wrong with you girls?" And she would always pinch us and make us smile. And we didn't really care. We told her the truth. We told her that it wasn't so. Our parents weren't killed by the Russians, and that we weren't orphans, that our father was there. That's why we're so sad. And she was just ever so sweeter to us. And she told us that she had wished we had told her before, and she says she could arrange for our father to be a night watchman at the convent, which would have been something, unbelievable yet. Well, that didn't happen, and it was all too late for that. Well, our father had given us quite a bit of money in gold coins, in American dollars, in jewelry that we kept hidden, and we didn't know what to do with. Well, we gave it all to our Mother Superior, and we told her, "This is the money our father gave us. Please hide it for us." And she did. The reason I'm mentioning it is because even so, Osnas and me were sent back to Warsaw, and my sister stayed on in the convent. After the war, the sisters gave all the money back to my sister. And so they also found out from my sister that I live in Paris, and kept writing to me letters nonstop and wanted me back, come back, yes. Of course, we know why. They were Catholic, and they were trying to now take all the Jewish children and keep all the Jewish children Catholic.
But they never betrayed.
The sisters never betrayed. Oh, indeed not.
How did you feel about Kopczynski?
I still love him. I still love him because he did so much to us, and I know how he felt about us kids. He was a third father to us, for he had no children, and he mostly weekends came to us because of the kids, because of the 4 kids in our house. And He loved us. He truly wanted to save us and keep us. After the war, when Mother came back from Russia, and of course she found out that he had my father's fortune, for some reason he never showed up, and he decided to keep the money, and he never talked to my mother. Whenever she'd come try and see him, he was out of town or he was somewhere. He wasn't around. She never got to see him. She talked to his wife, and but that was okay. I don't mind it at all. In fact, I never think of it at all. It doesn't matter. He did so much that a superhuman couldn't have done more. And he did it because he really respected and he loved my father, and he respected him for what my father taught him in the business world. For he took over a very big business, and in turn he did such a big favor to my father.
Any closing thoughts, Ruth, that you want to put on this tape?
Okay, even so, my father was able to save us. When I think back, I only wished that he had never left Russia, because we had, in our case, a chance to survive complete as a family. We really did, because my mother survived with 2 children, and she told us after the war that there was every chance for us. For when we were young children, we were allowed to go in Russia to school, or if we chose to work, so that there were enough of us that would help us to survive together. And if I think back, if anything, I wished we never returned back to Warsaw. And so I know that we would have had my father for much longer than we did. And of course, we were thankful to God that my mother survived, and we had her for that many years. Also, she, in our eyes, she was just such a young person. She was no different than us.
You mentioned the tree, her tree. Her
Mother had a way almost with every person and everything, and she had a plant on her patio for 20-some years. And she fed it her tea bags. She would have tea, and the rest of the tea and the torn tea bag would go for the tree. The tree lived exactly as long as my mother lived. And in the last 2 years of her life, I have been to Israel about 4 or 5 times. We took turns taking care of my mother. And she always remembered to do it, or would ask us to do. Be sure to put the tea bags into the plant. And the plant was beautiful. But when she was finally taken to the hospital, never to come back home, that tree didn't last any longer than she did.
Ruth, thank you. Thank you.